Growing up in this company, I was told by these seasoned drivers that we have a start time, no finish time. Don't make any plans. You know, there are drivers who I've heard throughout the years complain about not being able to see their children grow up because when they leave the house early in the morning, kids are sleeping. And when they upon their return, the kids are in bed. So,
That is
this is
Antoine
something that,
Andrews.
we want to
On
make
August
sure
1st, later this
we're
year,
not
there's a chance that he won't show up to work. Antoine won't step foot in the United Parcel Service or UPS hub in Canarsie, Brooklyn, where he's worked for 26 years. He won't hop into his iconic brown UPS truck. You know, the ones that you see everywhere. And he won't deliver any packages to businesses or to households. If you're on his regular route in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, sorry to say that he won't be there to smile and ask how your day was. He won't be sick, nor will he be on vacation with his family. No, he'll be out on strike with nearly 350,000 of his coworkers in what could be one of the largest strikes in American history. Hey, my name is Teddy Ostro, and I'm a labor reporter.
My name's Ruby Walsh, and I'm an audio producer.
Welcome to the Upsurge. This is the first episode of a podcast about a labor fight this year at UPS, which is arguably one of the most consequential fights for the labor movement in a generation. We'll cover more details later with our guests on the podcast, which are UPS workers themselves, including Antoine. But I want to just give you the basics first. The labor contract, or the collective bargaining agreement, between UPS and its workers, who are represented by the Teamsters union, it's going to expire this year on July 31st. If workers don't get a new contract, and if they don't get their key demands met, we could see a strike of UPS's enormous workforce. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened. There was a national UPS strike in 1997, but this one could be significantly larger, and there are many reasons why this is so important.
Right. And one is obviously that if there's a strike, we, the consumers, we're definitely going to feel it. So our packages won't be delivered, we won't see UPS trucks on the streets, and even some stores, maybe some of your favorites, your locals, they might temporarily shut down because they don't have the delivered goods they need to operate.
Yeah, that's one angle. 6% of US GDP is moved by UPS. So a strike would be immensely disruptive to our daily life. But this podcast isn't so much about that disruption per se, or that potential disruption, but what that immense power that UPSers hold could mean for them, for their work, for their lives. But not only their work and their lives, but what a strike, successful or not, means for the work and lives for the rest of us. Now, some of you have probably heard more about labor unions in the past 3 years than you have in your entire life. That's certainly the case for me.
Yeah, and me too, definitely.
We'll dive into this in a later episode, but it should be relatively clear that we're living in some kind of special moment. Since the pandemic, we're seeing a greater willingness by workers to resist at their workplaces, to demand more from their employers. And that's not just for higher wages. That's for more time off the job, or just other better quality of life issues.
Right, and I think the key to this is that this resistance does appear to be channeled a bit more through labor unions right now. And while the labor movement remains pretty weak relative to the past, we're seeing these upticks in activity. That means more union election filings and more strikes.
Right, and what I think is additionally fascinating about what's going on is the character of some of that organizing and activity. We're seeing organizing among small shops, for example, or small workplaces, that is, like individual cafes at Starbucks, which was not really thought possible in the past. We're seeing more bottom-up organizing also, workers organizing themselves in the workplace, which someone unfamiliar with labor probably would think is what always happens. But no, that hasn't really been the dominant trend in the recent decades of union organizing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of you are probably aware that there's been a ton of coverage of workplaces unionizing this year. So think of Starbucks, Amazon, REI, Chipotle, and you've probably seen these photos of crowds cheering, the lead organizers beaming, and that's when the coverage cuts out. So what we're interested in is actually everything that happens after that point. And the truth is that that victory, that first moment where they unionize, that's really just the beginning of a long struggle. UPS's union has been around for decades, almost 100 years now, and the Teamsters were around when unions were strong in the 30s. And even as most places lost their unions, UPS Teamsters membership stayed up. It actually grew by the tens of thousands in just the last few years. So I guess what we're here to ask is not what does it take to unionize, but what does it take to maintain a union, to build one, to improve one, and to make it work for its members?
I think critical to what we're focusing on is that there's been more energy in reform movements within existing unions. And that's really a big part of the story at UPS, at the union that represents its workers, the Teamsters. The reason why we're at this juncture is because of broader changes in our economy, the broader shifting of workers' attitudes right now, but also specifically what's going on at the Teamsters Union. And I think a part of this podcast is to try to convince you that it's something to care about. It's something to understand, to follow. Much like a lot of you may follow the ins and outs of electoral politics, for example. Ultimately, this is a podcast about UPS, the Teamsters, and how the struggle between the two is in many ways a struggle for the future of the broader US labor movement. That's why this podcast is called The Upsurge. There's a pun in there if you didn't notice, but we probably should have added a question mark at the end of it, because we're sort of asking, are we witnessing the beginnings of an upsurge? Not only at UPS, but in labor organizing generally, the likes of which we haven't seen in several decades. Now, this is not the only major labor fight that's going to happen this year. You're going to hear about others, but it's arguably the largest one and could have the most impact. We want to explore how, and we want to explore why.
And we're going to do this through interviews, mostly with the rank and file, so you'll be hearing primarily from UPS workers themselves, including in this episode today.
Yeah, we promise that our introductions won't be this long every time, but it's the first episode, so we do have to kind of set the table. But I'll be your main host in coming months, and Ruby will be popping in and out for interviews, maybe a little this and that.
Yeah, I think a lot of this and that.
For this episode, we spoke with two UPSers, two Teamsters, to sort of, as I said, set the table a bit for the podcast. Talk more about some of the things we just briefly discussed. You'll be hearing from Tony Rosario and Antoine Andrews, both from New York City, both members of the Teamsters Local 804, which, if you don't know, is a really strong local branch of the union. Each of them have been working at UPS for almost 30 years, so they're experts of their own jobs. Tony has been at UPS for almost 29 years, and Antoine, 26.
The workers are definitely the experts of what they do, of their craft, of the company, so we want to help all of you at home understand how they all got to this point where they're ready to strike. So, for this episode, we recorded on December 29th, 2022, right at the tail end of what's called peak season. This is basically the busiest season of delivery and retail for the holidays, and most of you probably know that. We all end up spending a lot more money in December than maybe any other time of the year. But what that means on their end is that courier workers are met with an avalanche of packages day in, day out. So those gifts you bought online for friends and family this season, a lot of them probably passed through UPS hands. And as you're going to hear in this episode, peak season can be a grueling time for logistics workers like those at UPS, Amazon, FedEx. It's during this time that a lot of the issues that these workers deal with all the time, the unsustainable pace of work, the long hours, low wages, forced overtime, this is when they come to a head. Tony and Antoine helped us to understand how their experiences during peak season relate to the broader contract campaign this year.
That's right, and I've actually done some reporting on this topic, and something you'll hear from Antoine, and this is something I've actually heard from workers across the country, is that this year's peak was a bit easier than the others. There's a variety of reasons why that could be. UPS did staff up for the season. Package volumes seem to be decreasing because of the impact of inflation on consumers' wallets. But what's alarming is that on the flip side, during the rest of the year, it feels like a perpetual peak. There's grueling hours, there's shocking package volumes, and they never really stopped since 2020's peak, when there was an explosion in e-commerce. One worker, Steve Dumont, told me it's been like Christmas for 3 years. Now, I think that's actually enough context for now. It's time to hear from the UPS workers themselves, Tony and Antoine. I do want to note that we did have some audio issues at some points in the interview, so please forgive us. This is our first episode, and we are going to be learning along the way.
Yeah, Teddy and I are going to shut up now.